I'm Eleanor Winters, 68, and I've never been more terrified than when I got that call. Mrs. Winters, there's someone in your house, Mariana whispered. He's upstairs. I'm hiding in the pantry. My blood froze. My husband Richard was on a golf trip, and our children lived states away. I'd hired this cleaning service just yesterday, a whim after decades of handling my own housework. Now this stranger was huddled in my kitchen while an intruder roamed above. What Mariana couldn't know was who might be upstairs and the secret I'd kept from my family for 30 years. Before I tell you how this terrifying situation unfolded, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. This story taught me that family secrets can have unexpected consequences. If you've ever had a moment where truth and deception collided in your family, hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about the complicated web of family relationships. Now, let me take you back to how this all began. I've lived in the same colonial house in Oak Ridge, Connecticut for nearly 40 years. It's a beautiful home with white shutters, a wraparound porch, and too many rooms for two aging people to maintain properly. After retiring from my position as the head librarian at Oak Ridge Elementary 5 years ago, I settled into a comfortable routine with Richard, my husband of 45 years. He's a retired accountant who now spends most of his time perfecting his golf swing or watching baseball from his favorite recliner. Our life together has been predictable, if not always exciting. Breakfast at 7, crossword puzzles with coffee, Richard puttering in the garage while I tend to my garden. We raised 2 children here, Jessica, now a successful attorney in Chicago, and Thomas. Well, Thomas was a more complicated story. As we've gotten older, the 4-bedroom house has become increasingly difficult to maintain. The stairs creak in protest when I climb them, much like my knees. The high ceilings collect cobwebs faster than I can reach them with my extendable duster. The hardwood floors need constant attention to maintain their warm glow. We don't need strangers in our house, Richard would say whenever I mentioned hiring help. We've managed just fine all these years. That was Richard, stubborn and set in his ways. But he wasn't the one who spent hours hunched over, scrubbing the bathroom tiles. He wasn't the one who felt the ache in his lower back after vacuuming the entire house. For decades, I'd taken pride in keeping our home spotless while raising 2 children and working full-time. But at 68, I was tired. Bone tired. The idea of hiring help had been planted by my friend Susan during our weekly coffee dates. Susan had a cleaning service that came bi-weekly, and she raved about how it had changed her life. "Eleanor, there's no medal for suffering," she told me, stirring her latte. "You deserve help. We're not spring chickens anymore." I laughed at her candor, but the seed was planted. Every month, Richard went on a golf trip with his college buddies. 3 days of golf, poker, and reminiscing about the good old days. It was his sacred ritual, one I'd never dream of interrupting. His April trip presented the perfect opportunity. The winter had been harsh on my back, and spring cleaning loomed like an insurmountable mountain. I made my decision. The moment Richard's car disappeared down our tree-lined street, I called the number Susan had given me. Mariana arrived the next day for a consultation. She was a petite woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and calloused hands. She'd started her cleaning business 5 years ago after moving from Guatemala. A single mother of 3, she had built her business through hard work and word of mouth. I liked her immediately. We walked through the house together, discussing my cleaning priorities. The baseboards needed attention, the kitchen cabinets needed to be wiped down, the guest bathroom hadn't been deep cleaned in months. Mariana took notes and gave me a reasonable quote. We scheduled her first cleaning for the following day when I had planned a spa day with Susan. "Just the main living areas and bedrooms," I told her as we finished our tour. "Don't worry about the attic. That's just storage up there, nothing that needs cleaning." I hadn't been in the attic for years. It was Richard's domain, filled with Christmas decorations, old tax returns, and boxes of the children's school projects I couldn't bear to throw away. Just another space filled with dust and memories. The next morning, I left a house key under the mat for Mariana, and a list of cleaning supplies in the laundry room. It felt strange, rebellious even, to be leaving my home in someone else's hands after decades of doing everything myself. But as I backed out of the driveway, I felt a surprising lightness. For once, I was putting myself first. The morning of my spa day dawned bright and clear. I woke early, as I always do, and went through my usual routine. I made coffee, straightened the living room, and made sure the bathrooms were presentable enough for a stranger to clean them. It's funny how we clean before the cleaning lady comes, a little quirk of human nature, I suppose. I laid out fresh towels in each bathroom and gathered the cleaning products from under various sinks into a basket for Mariana. I wanted to make her job easier, to be a good client. I'd been on the other side of service work in my younger days, waitressing through college, and I knew how much small considerations meant. Mariana arrived promptly at 9, her car loaded with professional equipment. I didn't own a steam cleaner, a professional vacuum, microfiber mops. She was dressed in a simple blue shirt and jeans with her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Good morning, Mrs. Winters," she said with a warm smile. "Please, call me Eleanor," I insisted, handing her the house key. "I've left a list on the kitchen counter. I should be back around 4. "Don't worry about anything," she assured me. "Your house will sparkle when you return." I hesitated at the door, feeling strangely vulnerable. This was my domain, my private space being handed over to someone else. But I pushed the feeling aside and got into my car. Susan was waiting for me at the Oak Ridge Spa and Wellness Center. The spa was everything I needed. Susan and I were pampered with hot stone massages, facials, and pedicures. For lunch, we sat in plush robes on the terrace, eating Mediterranean salads and sipping cucumber water. We gossiped about the neighborhood, discussed our children, and lamented the state of our aging bodies. "So how does it feel to be a lady of leisure?" Susan teased, wiggling her freshly painted toes. "Letting someone else do the dirty work for once?" "Decadent," I admitted. "Richard would be horrified." "What Richard doesn't know won't hurt him," she said with a wink. It was during my facial that I missed the first call. My phone was tucked away in a locker, set to vibrate. By the time Susan and I were having lunch, Mariana had called twice. When I checked my phone between courses, I saw the missed calls and a text message that made my heart skip. "Mrs. Winters, please call me. Emergency." I excused myself from the table and called her immediately. When she answered, her voice was barely above a whisper, tight with fear. "Mrs. Winters, there's someone in your house," she said, her accent thicker with panic. "I'm hiding in the pantry." "What do you mean?" I asked, my own voice dropping to a whisper, as if the intruder could hear me. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she breathed. "I was cleaning upstairs and heard noises from the attic. Then footsteps, heavy footsteps, a man. He came down from the attic into the hallway. I ran downstairs to hide. My mind raced with possibilities. A burglar? But in broad daylight? In our safe neighborhood? "Mariana, listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Get out of the house right now. Just leave everything and go." "I can't," she whispered. "He's coming downstairs. I think he's in the kitchen now." My blood ran cold. I was 20 minutes away, at minimum. "I'm calling the police," I told her. "Stay hidden. Don't make a sound." I ended the call and dialed 911 with shaking fingers, quickly explaining the situation to the dispatcher. They promised to send officers immediately, but said it would take about 15 minutes for them to reach my address. I threw money on the table for our lunch, apologized to a confused Susan, and ran to my car, still explaining the situation over my shoulder. The drive home was a blur of fear and horrible imaginings. What if Mariana was hurt? What if the intruder was still there when I arrived? I called Richard, but he didn't answer. Probably in the middle of his golf game, oblivious to the drama unfolding at home. My mind flashed to news stories I'd read about home invasions gone wrong. Just last month, there had been a break-in 2 towns over where the homeowners had returned to find their place ransacked. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and pressed the accelerator. As I turned onto my street, I scanned for police cars but saw none. The dispatcher had said 15 minutes, but it felt like hours had passed since my call. My house looked peaceful from the outside, white shutters gleaming in the afternoon sun, flower beds newly mulched. Mariana's car parked in the driveway beside my empty spot. No police, no sign of disturbance. Just my home, looking exactly as it always did. But somewhere inside was Mariana, terrified and hiding, and someone else, someone who had no right to be there. I parked on the street rather than the driveway, thinking it might be better not to announce my arrival. For a long moment, I sat in my car, watching the house. Should I wait for the police? That would be the sensible thing to do. But what about Mariana? What if she was in immediate danger? The uncertainty was unbearable. I opened my glove compartment and grabbed the small canister of pepper spray my daughter Jessica had insisted I carry. It wasn't much protection, but it was better than nothing. Moving as quietly as possible, I approached from the side of the house, away from any windows facing the street. The spare key was always hidden in a fake rock by the side door, a security risk. Richard and I had debated many times over the years. Now, I was grateful for my stubbornness in keeping it there. The door opened silently. I'd always been meticulous about oiling the hinges. I slipped inside, into the mudroom that connected to the kitchen. The house was eerily quiet. No sound of cleaning, no vacuum running, no music playing, just silence. I crept through the mudroom into the kitchen, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. The kitchen was immaculate. Mariana had clearly finished cleaning this room before the interruption. The pantry door was slightly ajar. I approached cautiously, pulling it open with one hand while holding the pepper spray ready with the other. Empty. No Mariana. Where was she? Had she managed to escape? Or had the intruder found her? The cleaning supplies were still in the living room, bucket, mop, vacuum cleaner standing sentinel in the corner. But no sign of Mariana herself. A soft creak came from upstairs, the distinctive sound of the floorboard outside the master bedroom. I knew that sound intimately. It had announced Richard's late-night trips to the bathroom for decades. Someone was definitely upstairs. My phone vibrated in my pocket, nearly causing me to scream. Richard. Finally returning my call. Eleanor? What's going on? I saw you called 3 times, he whispered his name urgently. There's someone in the house, I whispered back. The cleaning lady called me, terrified. She was hiding in the pantry, but now I can't find her. There was a pause on Richard's end. Cleaning lady? What cleaning lady? Not the time for that discussion. I hired someone to help with the house, I said quickly. That's not important right now. I think there's an intruder upstairs. Another pause, longer this time. Richard said slowly, is the attic door open? The question hit me like a bucket of ice water. The attic. My instructions to Mariana not to clean there. The noises she heard coming from above. Richard, I began, but stopped as I heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, not trying to be quiet. I have to go, I whispered into the phone, and ended the call. I pressed myself against the wall, pepper spray clutched in my trembling hand. The footsteps continued down the stairs. I held my breath as they reached the bottom and turned toward the living room. And then I saw him. A tall man with disheveled dark hair stood in my living room, looking as startled to see me as I was to see him. For a moment, we stared at each other in frozen silence. He was thin, too thin, with a week's worth of beard on his hollow cheeks. He wore jeans that hung loose on his frame and a faded blue t-shirt I didn't recognize. But I recognized his eyes. I would know those eyes anywhere. Thomas? My voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Mom? He looked panicked, glancing toward the door as if calculating whether he could make a run for it. I lowered the pepper spray, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. Thomas, I repeated, this time not a question. My son, my youngest, the troubled child who had broken our hearts over and over again. It had started when he was 13, the mood swings, the falling grades, the fights with his father. By 16, he was experimenting with drugs. By 18, he was in full-blown addiction, stealing from us to support his habit. Richard and I had tried everything, therapy, tough love, rehabilitation programs. Nothing worked for long. The final break came when Thomas was 25. Richard found his gold watch, a retirement gift, missing, along with several other valuable items. Thomas denied taking them, but we'd been down this road too many times before. Richard gave him an ultimatum: get help or get out. Thomas chose the latter. For 12 years, our family had been fractured. Jessica, always the peacemaker, tried to maintain relationships with everyone, but even she had given up on her brother when he disappeared 3 years ago. No calls, no messages, just gone. Richard had officially disowned him after that. We don't have a son anymore, he would say whenever Thomas's name came up. We have a daughter. But mothers don't disown their children. Not really. Not in their hearts. I'd kept tabs on Thomas as best I could over the years, sending money to his last known address, meeting him for coffee when Richard was out of town. keeping his childhood photos in a box under my bed rather than displayed on the mantel as Richard had demanded. And now, here he was, standing in my living room, looking simultaneously like a stranger and like the little boy who used to curl up beside me during thunderstorms. "What are you doing here?" I asked, struggling to process his presence. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture he'd had since childhood. "I didn't think anyone would be home," he said, his voice hoarse. "Dad's golfing. You're usually at your garden club on Thursdays." The fact that he knew our schedules was unsettling. "Have you been watching the house?" He looked down at his feet. "Not exactly." He took a deep breath. "I've been living in the attic for about 2 months now." The room seemed to tilt sideways. I reached for the back of the couch to steady myself. "In our attic? All this time?" He nodded, shame evident in every line of his body. "I completed a rehab program 6 months ago. Got clean. For real this time. But I couldn't find work. Nobody wants to hire someone with my record. I ran out of money for rent. And—" He trailed off, then looked up at me with those familiar eyes. I had nowhere else to go. I sank onto the couch, trying to absorb this information. My son had been living above our heads for months, and we hadn't known, sneaking in and out when we weren't home, using the spare key I always insisted on keeping hidden. The cleaning lady, I remembered suddenly. "Where is she?" "She ran out the front door when she saw me," Thomas said. I tried to explain, but she didn't understand me. Or she was too scared. "I don't know." I stood up quickly. "Mariana, we need to find her before the police arrive." "Police?" Thomas's face went pale. "Mum, I can't go back to jail. I'm clean now, I swear." The desperation in his voice tore at my heart. Whatever he had done, whatever mistakes he had made, he was still my son. And in that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. "Listen to me," I said, taking his face in my hands. "We're going to figure this out. But you need to tell me the truth. All of it. Are you really clean?" He met my gaze steadily. 384 days. I have my chip in my pocket. I believed him. Maybe I was a fool, but I believed him. "Okay, this is what we're going to do. I've been thinking a lot lately about how we protect the people we love, even when that protection might not be what's best for them. If you've ever had to make a tough choice between truth and protection in your family, you know exactly what I mean. This moment with Thomas was my crossroads. What would you have done in my shoes? Sometimes I still wonder if I made the right call. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Thomas and I searched the house, calling Mariana's name softly. We found no sign of her until I noticed the guest room closet door closed tightly. When I opened it, Mariana was curled in the corner behind the winter coats, her cleaning apron wrapped around her knees, eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," I said, reaching out a hand to her. "This is my son, Thomas. I'm so sorry he frightened you." Mariana looked from me to Thomas and back again, confusion evident on her face. Her English was good but not perfect, and I could see her struggling to understand the situation. "Your son?" she repeated. "But you say no one home?" "I didn't know he was here," I explained, helping her to her feet. "It's complicated." Thomas stood awkwardly in the doorway, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her further. "I'm really sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to scare you." Before I could explain further, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police, finally arriving. Panic flashed across Thomas's face. "Mom," he said urgently, "I can't be here when they come in. I'm on probation. If they find me living in your attic without your knowledge—" He didn't need to finish. We both knew what would happen. Thomas would be arrested for trespassing, violation of probation, and who knows what else. He'd be back in jail, all his progress erased. "Go to my car," I said quickly, pressing the keys into his palm. "It's parked on the street. Stay down until I come get you." As Thomas slipped out the back door, I turned to Mariana. "Please," I said, taking her hands in mine. "Don't mention my son to the police. Say it was a misunderstanding. That you heard noises, but it was just the old house settling." Mariana looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then the doorbell rang, followed by an authoritative knock. "Police? Anyone home?" I squeezed Mariana's hands one more time before going to answer the door. 2 officers stood on my porch, a middle-aged man with a buzz cut and a younger woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Mrs. Winters?" the male officer asked. We received a call about a possible intruder? I nodded, putting on my best librarian voice, calm, controlled. Yes, that was my cleaning lady who called. I think there's been a misunderstanding. The officers exchanged glances. Ma'am, we'd like to come in and take a look around, if that's all right. Of course, I said, stepping aside, though I'm sure everything's fine. The officers conducted a thorough search of the house, checking every room, closet, and corner. When they reached the attic, I held my breath. They found the space Thomas had created for himself, a sleeping bag, some clothes, a few books, and an old camping lantern. Mrs. Winters, the female officer said, concern evident in her voice, it appears someone has been living in your attic. Did you know about this? I feigned shock and dismay. Living in my attic? That's impossible. My husband and I would have heard something. Well, someone has definitely been up here, the male officer said. I recommend changing your locks and securing any exterior access points to the attic. You might want to consider a security system as well. They questioned Mariana next, and I watched anxiously as she spoke to them in halting English. To my immense relief, she stuck to the story she had heard noises, got scared, and called me. Perhaps she had overreacted. Perhaps it was just an old house making sounds. The officers seemed skeptical but had no reason to doubt us. They left with warnings about securing the house and instructions to call if we noticed anything else suspicious. When they were gone, I turned to Mariana, overwhelmed with gratitude. Thank you, I said simply. She studied me for a long moment. He is really your son? She asked. I nodded. Yes, he's had problems, but he's trying to do better now. Mariana's expression softened. My brother, she said quietly. He also had problems with drugs. For many years. Now he is 5 years clean, working, with family. She straightened her shoulders. Everyone deserves second chance. The simple compassion in her words brought tears to my eyes. This woman, who I'd known for less than 2 days, was showing more understanding than my husband had in 12 years. Would you like to meet him properly? I asked. He really is sorry for frightening you. Mariana hesitated, then nodded. I retrieved Thomas from my car, and we all sat at the kitchen table. Over cups of strong coffee, I explained the situation to Mariana while Thomas sat silently, shame written all over his face. I can find different job, Mariana offered when I'd finished. If it makes problem for you. No, I said firmly. This isn't your fault, and I still want you to clean for us. If you're willing. Mariana looked at Thomas, then back at me. Family is complicated, she said simply. I understand secrets. As she gathered her cleaning supplies to leave, she paused by Thomas. My brother, she said. He thought he would never be okay again. But he is. You will be too. Thomas looked up at her, surprise and gratitude in his eyes. Thank you, he whispered. When Mariana was gone, I was left alone with my son and the weight of 30 years of family secrets. Once Mariana left, the house fell into a weighted silence. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, shoulders hunched, looking out of place in the pristine kitchen, a kitchen he'd grown up in but hadn't been welcome in for more than a decade. We need to talk, I said, sitting across from him. All of it, Thomas. I need to know everything. He nodded, running his finger along a grain in the wooden table, a nervous habit from childhood. Where do you want me to start? The beginning. After you left. After. I couldn't bring myself to say it. After your father disowned you. Thomas took a deep breath. I was using back then. You know that. When Dad kicked me out, I crashed with friends for a while. Then shelters. Then. He looked away. Sometimes the streets. My heart contracted painfully. I'd sent money whenever I could, but it clearly hadn't been enough. I tried to get clean a few times. It never stuck. I'd make it a month, 2 months, then something would happen. I'd lose a job or get into an argument, and he shook his head. I always went back to it. What changed? I asked. I overdosed, he said bluntly. 3 years ago, that's why I disappeared. I woke up in a hospital in Philadelphia, almost died. He rolled up his sleeve to show a long scar on his inner arm. They had to put in a central line. I was in bad shape. The thought of my son nearly dying alone in a hospital hundreds of miles away, with no family by his side, was almost unbearable. Why didn't you call? I was ashamed, he said simply, and I figured Dad wouldn't care anyway. The words stung. partly because I feared they were true. After that, I got into a long-term rehab program. 6 months inpatient, then another 6 in transitional housing. I've been clean since then. 384 days. He pulled a medallion from his pocket, his sobriety chip. I go to meetings every day, have a sponsor, the whole thing. I'm proud of you, I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. Thomas looked up, surprised. Really? Really? I reached across the table and took his hand. But I don't understand why you didn't come to me after you got clean. Why live in our attic like an intruder? He withdrew his hand, shame crossing his features. I tried to get work, applied everywhere. But as soon as they run the background check, he shrugged. Nobody wants to hire an ex-junkie with a record. What record? I asked, realizing how little I knew about my own son's life. Possession, petty theft, nothing violent, he added quickly, but enough to make me unemployable, apparently. I ran out of money, couldn't make rent, was about to be homeless again. His voice cracked slightly. I just needed a place to stay while I figured things out. I knew when you and Dad weren't home, knew about the spare key. I thought it would just be for a few days, but then days turned into weeks. How did you manage to live here without us noticing? I asked, still baffled. I was careful, he said. Only moved around when you weren't home. Kept all my stuff in the attic. Used the bathroom and kitchen when you were out. I've been picking up odd jobs for cash day labor, mostly. Enough to buy food. And you've just been watching us? All this time? He nodded, unable to meet my eyes. Sometimes I'd look through the heating vent down into the living room, watch you and Dad eating dinner or watching TV. A sad smile touched his lips. It was almost like being part of the family again. The thought broke my heart. My son, so close yet so far away, watching his parents through a vent in the ceiling. I found something while I was looking for Thomas's things in the attic, I said, pulling a worn notebook from my pocket. I hope you don't mind that I read a few pages. Thomas went very still. My journal. I nodded. Just a few entries. You write beautifully, you know. You always did. One passage in particular had caught my eye. Watched Mom gardening today. She's planted those purple flowers she loves so much. Her hands have more age spots than I remember, and she stops to rub her back every few minutes. I wanted to go down and help her, carry the heavy bags of mulch. Dad was in the garage, probably wouldn't have seen me, but I couldn't risk it. Sometimes I think about what would happen if I just walked downstairs one day while they're having breakfast. Would Dad call the cops immediately? Would Mom defend me? Or have they both moved on, built a life that's better without the constant disappointment I brought them? Most days I think they're better off with me as a ghost. Thomas was watching me warily. I never meant for anyone to read that. I know, I said, but I'm glad I did. I needed to understand. We fell silent, the weight of years pressing down between us. The police said we should change the locks, I said finally. Thomas nodded, resignation in his eyes. I understand. I'll pack my things. No, I said firmly. You're not leaving. He looked up, confusion written on his face. You can stay in the guest room, I continued. No more attic, no more sneaking around. You're my son, and this is your home too. Mom, he said carefully, Dad won't allow it. You know that. Your father returns tomorrow, I acknowledged, and we'll deal with that when it happens. But I'm not throwing you back onto the streets. Not now, not ever again. The phone rang, startling us both. It was Jessica. Mom, is everything okay? Richard called me. Something about the police at the house? I took a deep breath. Jessica, there's something you should know. Thomas is home. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Thomas? She finally whispered. He's alive? Yes, I said, looking at my son across the table. And he'd like to talk to you. I handed the phone to Thomas, who took it with trembling hands. Jess? His voice broke on the single syllable. It's me. I left the room to give them privacy, but I could hear the rise and fall of their conversation, punctuated occasionally by Thomas's tearful laughter. By the time he sought me out, an hour had passed, and his eyes were red, but his face looked lighter than before. Jessica wants to come, he said, handing the phone back. She's booking a flight for tomorrow morning. I nodded, not surprised. Jessica had always been fiercely protective of her younger brother, even when his actions hurt her. Good. We'll need all the support we can get." Thomas hesitated, then asked the question that hung heavy between us. "What are we going to tell Dad?" I had no easy answer. "The truth," I said finally. "All of it. It's long overdue." As the evening shadows lengthened across the kitchen floor, I prepared a proper meal for my son for the first time in 12 years. We ate together, talking about safer topics, books he'd read, places I'd visited, Jessica's recent promotion. It felt surreal and precious, this unexpected reunion. After dinner, I showed him to the guest room. "No more sleeping bags in the attic," I said firmly. As I turned to leave, he called after me. "Mom?" I looked back to find him standing awkwardly by the bed, looking simultaneously like the grown man he was and the little boy he had been. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not giving up on me." I smiled through sudden tears. "That's not how motherhood works, Thomas. I never gave up. I never will." The next morning I woke early, half convinced that the previous day had been a dream. But when I passed the guest room, the door was ajar, and I could see Thomas sleeping peacefully, one arm thrown across his face just as he had done as a child. My son was home. The reality of Richard's imminent return hung over us like a storm cloud. I knew my husband, his stubbornness, his pride, his inability to forgive what he saw as betrayal. The confrontation ahead would not be easy. After breakfast, Thomas helped me clean out the attic, removing all traces of his secret residence. We brought down his few possessions, some clothes, books, toiletries, and the journal I'd discovered. "I wrote in it every night," Thomas explained as we sorted through his things. "It helped me stay sane, living up there. Helped me process things." I opened the journal again, this time with his permission, and read entries describing his observations of our daily routines. He'd watched Richard and me aging through the years, noted my increasing struggle with the stairs, Richard's persistent cough that he refused to have checked by a doctor, the quiet meals we shared with less and less conversation. "I felt like a ghost," Thomas said quietly, watching life happen but not being part of it. There were entries about his regrets, his determination to stay clean, his fear that he would never be able to rebuild a normal life. And there were entries about his hopes, modest dreams of reconciliation, of a job, of making amends. "I never thought I'd have the chance to actually say these things to you," he admitted. "I imagined conversations in my head, what I would say if I ever got the chance." As we worked, I caught glimpses of the man my son had become through his struggles, thoughtful, perceptive, carrying a hard-won wisdom earned through suffering. There was a gentleness to him that reminded me of the sensitive child he had once been, before the troubles began. Around noon, Jessica called to say her flight was boarding. She would be arriving at Bradley International by 3 o'clock. Richard was due home by 5. The timeline was tight, but having Jessica there first would help. She had always been able to moderate between her father and brother. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas grew increasingly anxious. "Maybe this is a mistake," he said, pacing the living room. "Maybe I should just go before he gets home." "No," I said firmly. "Running away hasn't solved anything so far. It's time to face this, all of us, together as a family." I found an old photo album in the hall closet, one I hadn't looked at in years. It contained pictures from when the children were young, before the troubles began. Thomas as a tow-headed toddler on Richard's shoulders, Jessica and Thomas building sandcastles at the beach, the 4 of us at Disney World, squinting in the Florida Sunday. I placed it on the coffee table just as the doorbell rang. Jessica. When I opened the door, my daughter stood there, carry-on bag in hand, her professional poise momentarily abandoned. "Where is he?" she asked, without preamble. I pointed to the living room, where Thomas had risen from the couch, uncertainty written all over his face. Jessica dropped her bag and ran to him, throwing her arms around her brother. They clung to each other, both crying openly. "Don't you ever disappear like that again," Jessica said fiercely, pulling back to look at him. "Do you hear me?" "Never again," Thomas nodded, unable to speak through his tears. For the next hour, the 3 of us sat together, filling in the gaps of the past 12 years. Jessica, always the practical one, immediately began making plans. "You can stay with me in Chicago until you find work," she told Thomas. "I have connections in several recovery programs that hire people in recovery." "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," I cautioned. "We still have to talk to your father." Jessica's expression hardened slightly. "Dad will just have to accept it. Thomas is family. End of story. If only it were that simple." Richard's capacity for holding grudges was legendary. His black and white view of right and wrong left little room for the gray areas of addiction and recovery. As 5 o'clock approached, we positioned ourselves strategically in the living room. Jessica and I on the couch, Thomas in the armchair by the window. The photo album open on the coffee table, a visual reminder of what we had once been. At 5:17, Richard's car pulled into the driveway. He would be tired from the drive, irritable from hours sitting in traffic. Not the ideal state for the conversation ahead. "Maybe we should wait until tomorrow," Thomas suggested, his face pale. "Let him rest first." "No," Jessica said firmly. "We do this now. Together." The sound of Richard's key in the lock was followed by the familiar thud of his golf bag being set down in the entryway. "Eleanor?" he called. "Why is there a rental car in the driveway?" He appeared in the living room doorway, still wearing his golf clothes, confusion on his face as he saw Jessica. "Jess? What are you doing here? Is everything okay?" Then his gaze shifted to the armchair, and he saw Thomas. The color drained from his face. For a long moment, no one spoke. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the sun he hadn't seen in 12 years. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out. The front door slammed behind him. Jessica jumped up to follow, but I held her back. "Give him a minute," I said. "This is a shock." Thomas hadn't moved from his chair, but I could see the devastation in his eyes. "I told you," he said quietly. "Nothing's changed." "Everything's changed," I countered. "You've changed. And your father will too. He just needs time." But as the minutes ticked by with no sign of Richard's return, my confidence wavered. Had I miscalculated? Had I underestimated the depth of my husband's resentment? Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, the front door opened again. Richard walked back into the living room, his face composed but his eyes guarded. "I think," he said carefully, "we have a lot to discuss." The morning of Richard's return dawned with a tension that hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Thomas barely touched his breakfast, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate while checking his watch every few minutes. "Stop watching the clock," I told him gently. "It won't make time go any faster." "Maybe I should just go," he said for the third time that morning. This was a mistake. I placed my hand over his. "Running away has never solved anything, Thomas. It's time to face this." Jessica arrived earlier than expected, her rental car crunching on the gravel driveway around 10. She had always been the composed one, the mediator, the problem solver. But even she looked nervous as she hugged me at the door. "How is he?" she whispered, meaning Thomas. "Terrified," I replied. "But holding on." She nodded, squaring her shoulders as if preparing for battle. "And you? Are you ready for this?" I wasn't sure how to answer. After 45 years of marriage, I was about to challenge my husband in a way I never had before. "I have to be," I said finally. Thomas and Jessica spent the morning catching up, their heads bent close together at the kitchen table. I kept busy cleaning an old habit when anxiety threatened to overwhelm me. By noon, every surface in the house gleamed, but my nerves were still raw. At one point, I overheard Jessica say to Thomas, "He's still Dad. Stubborn, proud, but he loves us. Remember that." Thomas's reply was so quiet I almost missed it. He loved who I was, not who I became. As the hour of Richard's return approached, we positioned ourselves in the living room. The old photo album lay open on the coffee table, a silent reminder of happier times. Thomas sat in the armchair by the window, his leg bouncing nervously. Jessica perched beside me on the sofa, her lawyer face on calm, composed, ready for anything. When Richard's car pulled into the driveway, Thomas froze, his face draining of color. Jessica reached across and squeezed his hand. "We're in this together," she reminded him. The sound of the key in the lock seemed unnaturally loud in the silent house. Richard's footsteps in the hallway, the thud of his golf bag being set down, his voice calling my name, the familiar rhythm of his homecomings, now charged with a different energy. "Eleanor? Why is there a rental car in the driveway?" Richard appeared in the doorway, still in his golf clothes, confusion on his face as he saw Jessica. "Jess? What are you doing here? Is everything okay?" Then his gaze shifted to the armchair, and he saw Thomas. The color drained from his face. For a long moment, no one spoke. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the sun he hadn't seen in 12 years. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out. The front door slammed behind him. Jessica jumped up to follow, but I held her back. "Give him a minute," I said. "This is a shock." Thomas hadn't moved from his chair, but I could see the devastation in his eyes. "I told you," he said quietly. "Nothing's changed." "Everything's changed," I countered. "You've changed. And your father will too. He just needs time." But as the minutes ticked by with no sign of Richard's return, my confidence wavered. Had I miscalculated? Had I underestimated the depth of my husband's resentment? Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, the front door opened again. Richard walked back into the living room, his face composed but his eyes guarded. "I think," he said carefully, "we have a lot to discuss." He took a seat in his recliner, as far from Thomas as the room allowed. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "Dad," Jessica began, but Richard held up a hand. "I'd like to hear from Thomas first," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Why are you here, son?" The word son hung in the air between them, a tiny acknowledgement, a fragile bridge. Thomas swallowed hard. "I've been clean for 384 days, he said, his voice steadier than I'd expected. "I completed a rehab program. I'm in recovery. I go to meetings every day." Richard nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And you decided to announce this by breaking into our house?" "I didn't break in," Thomas said. "I used the spare key." "Without permission," Richard countered. "That's trespassing." "Richard," I interjected. "He's been living in the attic for 2 months. We didn't even notice." Richard turned to me, shock and betrayal written on his face. "You knew about this?" "Not until yesterday," I said quickly. "The cleaning lady discovered him." "Cleaning lady?" Richard's brow furrowed. "What cleaning lady?" I realized my mistake too late. In the drama of Thomas's return, I'd completely forgotten that Richard knew nothing about Mariana. "I hired help while you were away," I said, lifting my chin slightly. "My back has been bothering me, and the house is too much for me to manage alone anymore." Richard stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. "So you hired a stranger to come into our home without discussing it with me, and somehow this led to discovering our son living in our attic like some sort of vagrant?" "Dad," Jessica intervened, her lawyer voice in full effect. "That's not the issue right now." "No?" Richard's voice rose. "Then please, tell me what is the issue, Jessica? Because from where I'm sitting, my wife has been making major decisions behind my back, and my son has been hiding in my house like a criminal." "I am a criminal, Dad," Thomas said quietly. "At least, that's what you've always thought." The raw honesty of the statement seemed to catch Richard off guard. He looked at his son, really looked at him perhaps for the first time. "I made mistakes," Thomas continued. "I stole from you. I lied. I broke your trust in every way possible. I can't undo any of that." He took a deep breath. "But I'm not that person anymore. I'm trying to be better. To make amends." "Amends," Richard repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. "Do you know what it did to your mother when you disappeared?" 3 years, Thomas. No word, no call. We thought you were dead." Thomas flinched. "I nearly was," he said. "I overdosed. Woke up in a hospital in Philadelphia." I gasped. He hadn't shared this detail with me. "Thomas, I was ashamed," he continued, looking directly at his father now. "Ashamed to have fallen so low. Ashamed to have failed again. I couldn't face you, either of you. So you just let us think you were dead?" Richard's voice cracked slightly, the first crack in his armor. "It seemed easier," Thomas admitted, "for everyone." Richard shook his head, disbelief and anger warring on his face. "Easier. That's always been your problem, Thomas. You take the easy way out, every time." "Getting clean wasn't easy, Dad," Thomas countered, a spark of anger in his own voice now. "Living in shelters wasn't easy. Facing the mess I've made of my life hasn't been easy. And yet here you are, hiding in our attic instead of getting a job like a responsible adult. I've tried." Thomas stood up, frustration evident in every line of his body. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to find work with a record? I've applied everywhere. Fast food, retail, construction. Nobody wants to hire an ex-addict with convictions. So you decided to become a squatter in your parents' home instead?" Richard's voice was cold again, the momentary vulnerability gone. "I had nowhere else to go," Thomas shouted. "I was about to be homeless again. I just needed a place to stay while I figured things out." "Richard," I interrupted, unable to stay silent any longer, This isn't helping. Richard turned to me, decades of marriage, allowing me to read the hurt and confusion in his eyes. And what would you suggest, Eleanor? That we just welcome him back with open arms? Pretend the past 12 years never happened? No, I said firmly. But he's our son. He's trying to rebuild his life, and I intend to help him. Richard stared at me for a long moment, then looked at Jessica, who nodded her support. I've offered Thomas a place to stay in Chicago, she said. And I have connections who can help him find work. So you've all decided, Richard said flatly, without any input from me. Dad, Jessica said gently, no one is trying to exclude you. We want you to be part of this. We need you to be. Richard stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to us all. The silence in the room was heavy with decades of hurt, regret, and unspoken words. You stole my watch, he said finally, still facing the window, my retirement watch, and your mother's pearl necklace, her anniversary gift. Thomas's face crumpled. I know, he whispered. I pawned them for drugs. I can't undo that. I wish I could. Richard turned back to face him. All these years, that's what I've thought about. Not the money you took, not the lies you told, but those specific items, things that meant something. I'm sorry, Thomas said, tears streaming down his face now. I was sick, I was desperate, but that doesn't excuse what I did. Richard's expression softened almost imperceptibly. No, it doesn't, he agreed, but perhaps it explains it. He walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. I don't know if I can trust you again, Thomas. I don't know if I can open myself up to that kind of pain again. I understand, Thomas said, wiping at his tears. I do, and I wouldn't blame you if you asked me to leave right now and never come back. Richard looked at him for a long moment, then at me, then at Jessica. The air between us was charged with the weight of a decision that would reshape our family forever. I need time, he said finally. I can't just flip a switch and forget everything that's happened, but... He hesitated, then continued in a voice that sounded older, wearier than I'd ever heard from him. But I'm willing to try, for all our sakes. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was a beginning. Jessica, ever the pragmatist, jumped in to solidify the fragile truce. Thomas will come stay with me in Chicago, she reiterated. He'll get established there, find work. We can take this slowly, one step at a time. Richard nodded, relief evident in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. That seems reasonable. Thomas looked at his father, hope and fear warring in his expression. Thank you, he said simply. Richard stood again, clearly overwhelmed by the emotional exchange. I need some air, he announced, and walked out of the room. The front door opened and closed again, more gently this time. As soon as he was gone, Thomas collapsed back into the armchair, trembling. That went better than I expected, he admitted. He'll come around, Jessica assured him, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. He just needs time. I nodded, knowing my husband better than anyone. Richard doesn't change his mind easily, I said. But when he does, it's permanent. Give him space to process all this. As the evening shadows lengthened across the living room floor, we sat together, mother, daughter, and son, reunited after years of fracture. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to resolved. But for the first time in 12 years, there was hope. That night, as Richard and I prepared for bed in awkward silence, he finally spoke. Why didn't you tell me about the cleaning lady? It seemed such a trivial concern in light of everything else that had happened. I almost laughed. You've always been so adamant about not having strangers in the house, I said. I knew you'd say no. He considered this, then nodded. You're probably right. He paused, then added, Did she do a good job? The normality of the question, after such an emotionally charged day, was oddly comforting. Yes, I said, she did. Richard nodded again. Then keep her on. You shouldn't have to clean this whole house by yourself anymore. It was a small concession, but a meaningful one. A sign that perhaps he was ready for change in other areas as well. And Thomas? I ventured cautiously. Are you really willing to try? Richard was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, I spent 3 years thinking my son was dead, Eleanor. Now he's alive. That has to count for something. It wasn't a declaration of love or forgiveness. It wasn't a promise of reconciliation, but it was a start. And sometimes A start is all you need. The autumn leaves create a patchwork of gold and crimson on the lawn as I rock gently on the porch swing, watching the late afternoon sun filter through the trees. 6 months can change so much, yet somehow not enough. Our family is healing, but healing is never a straight line. Thomas has been living in Jessica's guest room in Chicago since the day after our family confrontation. True to her word, Jessica connected him with a recovery-focused nonprofit that hires people in recovery. He started in their warehouse, packing orders, but has recently been promoted to an office position. His voice on our weekly calls sounds stronger, more confident. Richard's journey has been harder. A lifetime of black and white thinking doesn't change overnight. The weekly family therapy sessions Jessica insisted upon have been painful but necessary, revealing patterns of hurt and miscommunication stretching back generations. Richard's own father was an alcoholic who never sought treatment, a fact my husband rarely discussed, but which has colored his response to Thomas's addiction in ways none of us fully understood. I was always afraid Thomas would end up like my father, Richard admitted during one particularly difficult session. And when he started down that path, it felt like watching history repeat itself. Like failure. Your father never got help, the therapist pointed out. Thomas has. That's a significant difference. These small insights have slowly built bridges between father and son. Last month, Richard flew to Chicago for the weekend, his first solo visit with Thomas since the reconciliation began. They went to a baseball game together, neutral territory where they could sit side by side without the pressure of constant conversation. When Richard returned, he seemed lighter somehow, as if a burden had been partially lifted. "He looks good," was all he would say when I pressed for details. "Healthy." From Richard, this qualified as effusive praise. Mariana still comes twice a week to clean our house. What began as an employer-employee relationship has evolved into something warmer. She brings homemade tamales occasionally, teaching me how her grandmother made them in Guatemala. I help her daughter with college application essays. Small kindnesses exchanged between women who unexpectedly altered each other's lives. You know, she told me recently as we shared coffee after she'd finished cleaning, my brother says the best thing about recovery is learning to forgive yourself, is harder than forgiving others. I've thought about that wisdom often, especially as I've examined my own role in our family's dysfunction. For years, I enabled Thomas's addiction by secretly sending him money, believing I was helping when I was actually prolonging his suffering. I enabled Richard's rigid thinking by never challenging him directly, keeping my contact with Thomas a secret rather than fighting for my son openly. The path to healing has required my own painful reckonings. Last week, we celebrated Thomas's 1-year sobriety milestone. Jessica arranged a small ceremony in Chicago, and Richard and I flew in for the occasion. Watching my husband's face as Thomas received his 1-year chip pride warring with lingering caution, I saw how far we'd come and how far we still had to go. One day at a time, Thomas says now, the recovery mantra he once mocked, now a cornerstone of his rebuilt life. Yesterday, a letter arrived from Thomas. Not an email or a text, but a handwritten letter on actual stationery. In it, he thanked me for the courage I'd shown that day with Mariana, for refusing to turn him away when it would have been easier to do so. "You could have chosen Richard's way," he wrote. "You could have called the police or pretended you didn't know me. Instead, you chose to be my mother again, even when I hadn't earned that right. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that choice." I keep the letter in my bedside drawer, reading it when doubts creep in, when the road ahead seems too difficult. This weekend, Thomas is coming home for the first time since leaving for Chicago. Jessica will drive him, a buffer still needed between father and son. I've prepared the guest room fresh sheets, a vase of late-blooming asters, his favorite childhood books on the nightstand. Small touches to say, "This is your place. You belong here." Richard has been unusually quiet about the visit, but this morning he surprised me by asking if I thought Thomas might want to play a round of golf while he's here. "Nothing serious," he added quickly. "Just the municipal course, 9 holes." It was such a normal father-son activity, so ordinary yet so meaningful in our context, that I had to turn away to hide my tears. Recovery, I've learned, isn't just for addicts. It's for families torn apart by addiction, for marriages strained by secrets, for mothers who lose their way trying to protect everyone. Recovery is ongoing for all of us, a daily choice to face truth instead of hiding in comfortable illusions. As the sun dips lower in the sky, I hear Richard's car in the driveway, returning from his regular golf game. A few moments later, another car pulls up Jessica's rental, with Thomas in the passenger seat. My husband and son step onto the driveway at almost the same moment, awkwardly acknowledging each other with nods that contain volumes of unspoken words. I rise from the porch swing and go to greet them all, this imperfect family of mine, still learning how to find our way back to each other, one day at a time. You know, sometimes the most unexpected moments in life teach us the most profound lessons. That phone call from Mariana changed everything for my family. It forced us to confront secrets we'd buried and begin the hard work of healing. I'd love to know if you've ever had a moment that unexpectedly changed your family's path. Has truth ever found its way to the surface in your life in ways you never expected? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story touched you, please consider subscribing to hear more family journeys like this one. Life doesn't always give us neat endings with perfect closure, but sharing our stories helps us remember we're never truly alone in our struggles. Thank you for listening to mine.